Today we'll speak on the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. We previously spoke elaborately on the introduction, and we set the stage for what the future chapters would be. Today we'll focus on the first chapter, and it is interesting to note that every chapter in the Bhagavad Gita can be viewed as having a certain theme to offer, a very specific theme. The theme could be mental challenges, overcoming mental challenges. The theme could be understanding the nature of suffering. So today we're going to focus on the first chapter, and the overall subject matter of the first chapter, the conversation and the content, exemplifies or brings forth great mental suffering on the participant. And the participant here is Arjun. He is a monarch. He's a ruler, but he is theistic. He's also a devotee. He's a servant of God, and he is being assisted and directed by the Lord himself, Krishna, who appeared 5,000 years ago to re-establish theism on the planet. Now, they are situated right in the middle of a battlefield and right at the inception of a fratricidal conflict of epic proportions. If we are pacifists, which is what religion also teaches us, which teaches us compassion, it teaches us selflessness, it teaches us, not to be cruel, not to kill is one of the commandments, for instance. And we also wonder how is it that such a major conversation on divinity, major conversation on divine love was spoken about on a battlefield. And I just want to speak about it very briefly. We have dealt with it quite elaborately in the introduction, but it is important for us to understand as to why there was a conflict. Now, what is happening here is that we are having a conflict, and not all conflicts are to be condemned. For instance, in recent history, who would condemn the Allies invading and entering in and pacifying or sort of putting down Nazi and fascist forces? That was required. If the Allies had not done what they had done in the 1940s during World War II, we would have a completely different world history. There would have been a lot more bloodshed and needless killing. Similarly, we have other conflicts throughout history where a certain amount of force was required to offer protection and to protect the righteous. Therefore, force is not to be condemned just as much as the picking up of a knife by a surgeon for him to be able to remove a tumor is required. So he really cannot put down the knife at that point and say that I would not perform this surgery because I would be cutting up the person who is lying in front of me. That would be going against the interests of the patient. Similarly, sometimes in the interest and the best interest of society, it is required that the rulers take up arms to protect the citizenry. It is required, for instance, that every town has a police force, and it is required by the police force to sometimes pick up arms to protect the citizens against those who intend to harm them. So this was a similar situation where on one side you had the atheists who could cause intense harm to the population for many, many centuries, and on the other side you had theistic rulers. And one of them, a key general on the theistic side, had an intense issue. The moment he saw the opposite side was filled with his cousins, it was filled with his uncles and teachers and so on, there was an intense mental agony and conflict that caused him to go through a few minutes of great indecision. And I just want to read a few verses from the Bhagavad Gita which exemplifies his spirit at the time. It is Bhagavad Gita 1.27, first chapter, 27th verse. The translation goes, when the son of Kunti, Arjuna, saw all these different grades of friends and relatives, he became overwhelmed with compassion and spoke thus. Bhagavad Gita 1.28, Arjuna said, my dear Krishna, seeing my friends and relatives present before me in such a fighting spirit, I feel the limbs of my body quivering and my mouth drying up. My whole body is trembling, my hair is standing on end, my bow Gandiva is slipping from my hand, and my skin is burning. I am now unable to stand here any longer. I am forgetting myself, and my mind is reeling. I see only cause of misfortune. O Krishna, killer of the Keshi demon. I do not see how any good can come from killing my own kinsmen in this battle, nor can I, my dear Krishna, desire any subsequent victory, kingdom, or happiness. So these verses exemplify or bring forth a mental situation of intense suffering, of someone who is being asked as a matter of duty, as someone who is a general in an army. He has to take up arms against his own relatives because they have taken up the side of darkness. In such a situation, there's a great agony that's going on, and then we are only classifying that the broad theme that's coming forth here is one of mental suffering. So what we want to do here is we want to stop getting deeper into the verses of the Bhagavad Gita, but we want to focus on the theme of mental suffering. We want to examine suffering and understand the nature of suffering. We want to see if there's any difference between different aspects of suffering. We want to see and classify it. We want to take some examples, and we want to see if there's any use of suffering. How do we use it? After all, every one of us on this planet have to go through suffering. How do we use this suffering to move forward? How do we make progress? So let's just delve into the theme today, and the theme is of suffering. And we were just going through a few slides which we have put together, and we want to understand suffering, and then we'll get back into the actual events that took place 5,000 years back in chapter 1 of the Bhagavad Gita. So the theme is entitled Leveraging Pain and Suffering. Again, the theme is leveraging pain and suffering. Now we're on slide 3, which is in the presentation, for those of you who are using the slides. So we just want to make a distinction here. We oftentimes, in our usage of the words pain and suffering, we tend to mix the words pain and suffering. In reality, pain and suffering are very, very distinct words, and they do not mean the same. The meaning of pain and suffering are not the same. So we're going to look at a few categories of how pain and suffering are different. For instance, pain can end, but suffering can continue. Pain does not end, but there's no suffering. Pain is mostly gross, but suffering is subtle. So let's take a look at a few situations here. What we are saying here is that pain can end. So for instance, someone might undergo a surgery which could alter their body permanently. And in such situations, the pain of the surgery ends right there, but suffering continues. The person continues to suffer on account of being disabled. The person continues to suffer on account of looking at their bodies which are not what they were before because of a certain surgery. So the pain due to the disease could have been taken away, but the person has not healed. There's a big difference. In some cases, pain does not end, but there's no suffering. The pain does not end, but there is no suffering. Now let's understand the distinction here. The very good example of pain does not end, but there's no suffering is of mothers who go through a pregnancy and also go through a childbirth, which could be quite difficult. But once they deliver the child and are able to look at their child, the babies in their arms, the suffering ends. The pain continues because they had a difficult birth process, they had a difficult pregnancy. The pain continues, but then suffering ends because they're able to look at their babies and they're able to look at the outcome, they're able to appreciate the fact that all the pain that they went through eventually resulted in that bundle of joy, that child. So some cases here pain does not end, but then there's no suffering. Let's understand that. The first case we looked at the fact that pain can end, but suffering can continue. Second, pain does not end, but there's no suffering. And let's also look at the category of pain. Pain is inexorably, in most cases, it's experienced on the physical gross level. We experience pain as a certain stimulus where the body is telling us of discomfort. So if there is an attack, let's say if you fall down or if we have some kind of a disease, we experience pain, it is gross. On the other hand, suffering is a mental state. It is not a physical state. Suffering is a mental state. One can choose to suffer or not suffer based on their ability and their ability to cope with the pain. One chooses, in the case of the first situation, to suffer. Why do they choose to suffer? Because they see their body being disabled, their body being altered in permanent ways which they don't appreciate, as a consequence of which they continue suffering on the mental platform when their body has undergone a certain surgery, right? These days, cancer, for instance, invades most body parts, and sometimes it results in amputations, it results in surgery which permanently changes the body. And in such cases, every day when the person, the individual who has gone through such torment, looks at their body, they suffer. So suffering is mental and is independent of pain, and it can continue. Pain is mostly gross, and suffering is subtle. So in the second case, we looked at a pregnant woman, a woman who suffers through pregnancy and then has a difficult childbirth, and then once she sees the child, she's very happy. As a consequence now, even though there is pain on the physical plane, she's still recovering. She probably has gone through a very difficult childbirth, but there's no suffering. The mind is free of suffering. So pain is gross, suffering is subtle. Let's understand that distinction, because it's very useful for us to understand how, for most cases, the mind is capable of altering the unprocessing a certain event in life. Now, let's also look at distinct causes of intensity of pain and suffering. Pain and suffering can change, and it has different intensities. And then we want to look at the factors which increase or reduce the intensity. The foremost reason and the highest level of pain and suffering occurs when we really do not know why we are suffering, and we do not know why there's pain. Not knowing when pain and suffering are going to end, again, contributes to a great level of intensity. And the third and the last part which we want to focus on is not having people as a support structure, or a community which supports one who is in pain, can also increase pain and suffering manifold. So the intensity of pain and suffering is very high when we do not know why we are suffering. We do not know when it's going to end, and when we do not have anybody to hold on to. Three factors can change the intensity. I can give an example which I've often spoken about, is sometimes, for instance, and every one of us has gone through it, we go through and we get up in the morning and we go through some intense pain, for instance, in the lower abdomen. We wake up and we feel intense pain in the lower abdomen. And it's 7 o'clock in the morning, and we call the doctor and we fix an appointment, but the doctor's office is not going to give you an appointment, let's say, till 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So you have 7 o'clock in the morning till 2 o'clock, right? So from 7 o'clock in the morning till 2 o'clock, we hold on to the pain that's occurring in the lower abdomen. But we also try and discover what could be the cause of the pain. We try Googling the symptoms, and we have a wide array of why that pain is occurring. Sometimes we read that it could be due to cancer. Sometimes we read that it could be due to just gas. It could just be what we ate the previous night, or it could be something even worse. So when we read all of this, the anxiety of not knowing why there's such pain increases manifold. And suffering is very high. There's intense suffering because we really do not know why we are hurting. And then slowly, at the time of the appointment, we are on the doctor's table, the doctor examines us, and after examining us, he tells us that this is just a case of indigestion. It is just a case of you're eating something that you shouldn't have eaten. This is just gas, for instance. The moment we hear that the symptoms that we were experiencing and the pain that we were experiencing were due to something which could be very easily treated, it can end in a few minutes, we automatically feel a great relief, even though the doctor has not given us any medication. All he has done is give us knowledge. He has just provided knowledge to us on what the cause of the suffering was. He has just provided knowledge and telling us when it was going to end, because he has told us that this is just gas, and we know that taking some medication, even over-the-counter medication, could mitigate our problem. And automatically, we immediately find great relief. Now, let's understand this. From morning 7 o'clock, when the pain started, up to 2 o'clock, we did not know why we were hurting. So the suffering was very intense. We did not know why. We really did not know when it was going to end. we went into the doctor's office. The doctor did not give us any medicine. He did not give us any medication, so the pain continued while we were waiting in the doctor's office and we were on the doctor's table. All the doctor did was examine us and tell us that this was just a case of gas. The moment we hear that this is something very innocuous that can be cured very easily, and we knew that it is going to get cured in probably an hour or two, we automatically feel a great drop of suffering. And at that point in time, we have not even been treated. It has just been a mental placation, just something which our mind was able to accept and was able to relieve us. So this tells us that we continue to have pain, but suffering can end. So there's a very clear distinction between pain and suffering. And the last category which we spoke of not having anyone to hold on to while you're suffering, this does not require any explanation. Suffering is very intense when we are alone. But when we have company, even there's a saying that misery seeks company, there's a reason for that. The reason is that we want someone to hold on to us. We have someone who can relate to us. So that is a very distinct need for us to be able to seek some comfort. So we just looked at some distinct causes of intensity of pain and suffering. The intensity can vary, and we also gave an example that could distinguish pain and suffering. Now, why do we suffer? We want to understand why do we suffer. The reason why we're asking this question to ourselves is that suffering is a mental, subtle phenomenon. So one needs to understand why we suffer. This will allow us to examine if something can be done about it. The first and foremost reason for our suffering is our existence. If someone is alive and in a material body, a body that's constantly changing, an environment that's constantly changing, there are constant changes occurring which may not be something that we plan for, we intensely suffer. So we exist as a consequence of which we suffer. If we do not exist, we're not going to be suffering. So our material existence in reality is a cause of great suffering. Let's understand that. We exist on this material planet, and therefore we are condemned to suffer, because this planet has the ability to have an environment that could be very challenging. It has, being in this planet also means that we are situated in certain kinds of bodies which may not be perfect, and we bring in disease due to our genetical, situation or because of the environment, and there's so much suffering. So we exist and we suffer. So the first reason of suffering is we exist. So being alive and being conscious means we suffer. Let's look at number two. Why do we suffer? Let's understand that who we are is an aggregate. We are an aggregate of our past. We are an aggregate of hundreds and thousands and millions of lifetimes of existence in different bodies. We bring in all the action and reactions of those different existences into this particular lifetime, and we suffer due to the reactions of our past actions. It's very simple. And this is very easy to understand, even if you do not believe in rebirth, and even if you do not believe in the existence of the soul. Let's just understand in a very logical manner that whatever we did in our childhood has the ability to impact our youth, and whatever we did in our youth has the ability to impact our adulthood, and whatever we do in our middle age is going to impact us right until the time of leaving this planet at the old age or retirement, whatsoever. It's a very simple fact that the past impacts the present, and we extend the past to several lifetimes. We believe in the existence of the soul. We believe in the transmigration of the soul from one body to the other. We believe in the fact that we existed in the past and we committed certain actions, and we are responsible for the consequences of those actions. This is undeniable. If we have caused pain to others, we would also be put into a similar situation in this lifetime where we will be able to learn and experience the fact that we have caused pain to others. If we have been the reason for causing intense suffering to a certain relative, then we would have a certain relationship in this particular lifetime which is going to teach us lessons in that area of life. Actually, life is a school. It's a school of love. We're going to learn how to love properly, and that is going to require us understanding that we are basically products of our past. Any psychiatrist, any psychologist would give you the same answer. One of the areas of psychiatry and psychology is regression, past life regressions, and the idea is to be able to take a person back into the memories and the subconscious that exists, and being able to resolve the subconscious and being able to cure that malady which is occurring in the present. For instance, many of us carry different phobias, and different kinds of phobias come from the past. Some people have a fear of heights, and it has been proven by past life regressions that they have actually experienced great trauma in their previous lifetimes by falling from a bridge, for instance, or falling from a place which is highly situated, a building. And as a consequence, the impression on the subtle body, the impression on the mind is so extreme that they bring those impressions into this present lifetime, and they continue suffering from a certain phobia. Phobias are suffering. Let's face it. Being in fear is great suffering. And people bring that from the previous lifetime. So we are a sum total of our past. And that is undeniably true. We all carry reactions from the past, and as a consequence, we experience the past in the present. Now, the third category of why do we suffer is because we are also reflecting our present actions. Now, we have the past to deal with, which forms who we are as a personality and also puts us into certain circumstances of life. It creates a certain mindset, it creates a certain level of consciousness, it also brings us into a certain kind of environment. And you also have the present. How do you operate in the environment? What is the food that you eat? What is it that you do for a living? Who are the people you interact with? What kind of entertainment do you subject yourself to on day in and day out? How do we eat? How do we sleep? How do we mate? And how do we defend? These are different actions that we perform in the present, and this is going to determine our quality of life. And it is going to determine if we're going to suffer or we're not going to suffer. So now we had looked at three reasons. One is that we exist, we suffer. We exist, and as a consequence, we suffer because we are conscious. We are in human bodies that are constantly changing, that are deteriorating, that have been designed to be destroyed in a matter of few years, that are prone to disease, so we suffer. We are a sum total, an aggregate of our past actions, and we also reflect our present actions. Now, let's continue. Why do we suffer? In some cases, it's just not where we come from in the past. It is not so much about what we do in the present. It is because of a certain role that we play in society. In some cases, some of us are caregivers. In other words, we could be spiritual mentors. We could be mentors, they're caregivers in terms of, being able to physically take care of others, like you have doctors and physicians and healers and nurses and so on. And when we are caregivers, we are generally far more exposed to negative energies and far more exposed to even bacterial situations, for instance, in the physical plane. And we tend to be more prone to disease. For instance, there were studies that were clearly proven that people, doctors and nurses who exist to treat respiratory disorders are more prone to respiratory disorders because they are in the environment, they're caregivers, and they're more exposed. Similarly, someone who is a spiritual caretaker, he's a mentor, whenever he interacts with one of his mentees, whenever he interacts with people whom he's supposed to assist, he takes on energies, he takes on the negative impressions the other person carries to give them relief. And when he does that a lot, it drains him of his own energy. This is very clear, that whoever is assisting someone on a spiritual level has to be extraordinarily strong themselves. Their own practice and their own, their lifestyles have to be, extraordinarily well disciplined for them to be able to take on the energies of those whom they want to assist. So sometimes we suffer because we are caregivers and we're more exposed. Someone is just simply exposed because of the nature of service they offer to others. And why else do we suffer? Let's look at the other side. We also have a very limited ability to understand the big picture. And what is the big picture? The big picture is that we need to understand that everything has a certain use. It has a certain potential. and it has the ability to allow us to break free. So we have to understand that there is a big picture, and there's a God who is all loving and who is seeking our love, who is looking at us and is constantly protecting us, even though we think that He doesn't exist, or we act as if He doesn't exist. So there is a big picture. The big picture is understand that there's a reason for our suffering. There's a reason for the pain. And there is a big reason. There's a big picture for that. Now let's just take a couple of examples to understand how we could move forward with this big picture phenomenon of suffering. Since we don't understand and our ability is limited, we suffer. Now there was this sailor who was shipwrecked, and he happened to be the only survivor who somehow was able to cling on to a piece of wood, and he was able to swim ashore and reach an island. And while he was on the island, he was extraordinarily grateful the moment he reached there, because he understood that amongst the hundreds who were in the ship, he was the only one who could swim to safety. At least that was his understanding, because that island was completely uninhabited. There was no one else on the island. So the moment he reached the island and he was able to look at the fact that he survived, he was extraordinarily grateful. So he happened to build himself a little hut. He used the leaves and the bark and the coconut palms and so on and so forth, and he built himself a little hut. He found some means of being able to arrange for some food on a daily basis, and he continued his existence. But then after some time, the fact that he was alone and the fact that he was on this island, which had absolutely no inhabitants in the middle of nowhere, started acting on him, and he started suffering. There was great intense suffering where he basically used to constantly blame God on a daily basis for his misfortune. He started feeling at times that, I could have died with the others and that would have been far more easier. Why have I been put into the circumstance of being alone in this island in the middle of nowhere? Is there any chance of my getting back to my family? Is there any chance of my, reaching the city, or going back to civilization, so to speak? So there was great mental suffering. So he goes from gratitude on survival to great mental suffering because he's alone. Now one day, while he goes out to arrange food, and when he was returning back, he saw plumes of smoke and fire coming out at a distance, and this was coming from the direction of his little hut. As he came closer, he saw that his hut that he had built, which was his only source of shelter, was actually in flames. It was up in flames. Probably a freak of nature, maybe there was lightning, we do not know how, but the hut had caught fire and it was burning. And at that point, his suffering intensified greatly, because he was seeing there and saying, now all I had was a little hut, and you have burnt it down. You have just completely decimated the little hut that I had, and that's all I had for my future. You just burnt it down. So he was just going into a depths of almost, suicidal tendencies, because he didn't want to exist at that point. He was just thinking that how cruel could life be? First I get marooned, I have no one, and then I have no future, and here I have some little hut, and even that is getting burned down. As he was just reflecting on his misfortune, and the smoke from his hut was just going up, in a little distance, he could see a small ship. Actually, it was a small boat with a few sailors coming towards the island. He was overjoyed, and he was completely surprised. He asked them, saying, how did you reach here? What is it which made you reach here? They said that we were able to look at the smoke. We saw your SOS. We were able to see the smoke coming from the hut that was burning. And as a consequence, we made it to the island, because we found, we never thought there would anybody be living here. We wanted to see if you needed help. So this little story exemplifies the fact that many a time when we undergo suffering and when we undergo pain, we simply do not understand the big picture, because our scope to understand the big picture is so limited that our decision making and our suffering is because of this inability. A very simple way to counter this is for us to be able to accept our suffering and accept our pain as necessary and as a part of our maturing. If you accept it, and especially if you accept it as an arrangement of the Lord, where we start thinking that this has been arranged by the Lord, He is protecting us, it could only be worse if not for His protection. This particular instance would change the way we look at our present condition. The last part of why do we suffer is especially very, very important for a spiritualist to understand. A spiritualist needs to understand that he or she has to go across and be able to transcend the force of material nature. Transcending the force of material nature requires intensity, and intensity does not come from a complacent lifestyle. Intensity cannot come from one who leads a very complacent lifestyle where everything is going to be hunky-dory. Intensity comes when we are challenged. Intensity allows us to completely remove clutter. We can completely remove clutter and reprioritize our life and be able to take proper decisions when we have intensity. The laser-like intensity that is required for someone who is a spiritual aspirant is extraordinarily important, and such intensity can come about in certain unusual ways. It can come about in circumstances that are practically unbearable. And why does that happen? When we have circumstances that are practically unbearable, we use that as a platform. We should use it as a launching pad to go higher. One of the experiences that a spiritual aspirant goes through is that when they are intensely suffering, they should tend to use the energy that comes out for them to be able to launch themselves into deeper spirituality. One of the ways to do that is to take on your practice. If you are a practitioner of Bhakti Yoga, if you are a practitioner of certain mantras, take on the mantra of the deity form that you really like. You could be Christian, you could be a Muslim, you could be Jewish. It doesn't matter. If you take on the name of God, specifically in the name of God that you have faith in, very deep faith in, if you take on the name of God and call upon the name of God at the time of great suffering, such intense suffering would allow you to transcend such. It would allow you to transcend, because the deeper the suffering, greater would be our intensity. We would allow ourselves to move away from this body. Because understand this, the suffering occurs on this gross level. It does not occur, suffering occurs on the mental level. Pain occurs on the gross level, the physical body. So once we have some intense pain, the intense pain would allow us to reject this body. When we start rejecting the physical frame that surrounds us, it allows us to go deeper into the subtle. And when it goes deeper into the subtle, it allows us to be able to experience spirituality. It allows us to transcend matter. You transcend gross matter because you reject the body, which is painful. And you reject the body, which is painful, you go deeper, and you also reject the mind, which is the cause of suffering. And the moment you reject the body and the mind, which is the cause of suffering, that particular situation allows you, in combination with spiritual practice, for us to be able to go deeper and understand the nature of God. Please understand this very carefully. Every one of us is bound to go through intense bouts of suffering because we exist. Understand that. It's a fact of life. If you're going to step out in the open air, and if it's predicted that it's going to rain, you are going to get wet. It's as simple as that. So as simple as that is the fact that if you're going to be born in this world, we are destined to go through intense suffering at some point or the other due to some factor or the other. The same factors may not apply to everyone, but we all have to go through our phases of deep pain and suffering. And it's very important for those of us who are spiritual aspirants to hold on to the names of God, because the names of God are so powerful that in the times of suffering, the more our suffering, the greater our intensity of pain, one needs to focus their minds on the name of God. If you fight out your mental impulse and chant the names of God at the time of suffering, you will be able to penetrate the material covering. You will be able to penetrate and go far deeper into your spiritual pursuit than you ever had before. So in other words, we use our suffering as a matter of launch pads. Suffering and pain can be great companions for a serious spiritual aspirant. A real serious spiritual aspirant does not look for peace. We do not really ask for peace. We ask for the truth. And when we ask for the truth and we want to go closer to the truth and we want to understand God and we want to go and understand our relationship with Him and we want to understand the activities that we perform in the relationship, we want anything and everything in this world to occur for us to be able to reach that single objective of being able to understand who we are, being able to understand who is God, and being able to understand the relationship that we have with Him. Anything is welcome. So we are not looking for peace. We are looking for understanding our relationship with God and being able to act in that. So transcending matter is very, very important, and pain gives us the ability to do so. So leveraging pain, which is the theme of this class, or rather this sharing, leveraging pain is basically our focus here. We want to use pain to focus and prioritize. We want to be able to use pain to focus and prioritize. In some cases, people get diagnosed with terminal cancer or terminal diseases, and they're given 6 months or 1 year at most on this planet. The moment they hear that they only have 6 months, their life patterns do not remain the same. They reject the patterns that existed before and start reprioritizing life and start looking at what they need to do in this limited amount of time. So for instance, you have pain, you start prioritizing, you start focusing on the most important aspect. So similarly, if someone has a body which is debilitated, which is full of pain, one starts focusing on how to prioritize when you are in such a situation. And it is very, very important for us to be able to combine spiritual practice when we want to focus and prioritize. You cannot escape from pain and suffering which are a part of the body. You cannot escape from that until you combine it with a plan to elevate yourself beyond the body. Unless you have a plan for you to be able to go on a spiritual platform which is beyond the body, beyond the mind, you will not be able to use pain. So first you have to establish a spiritual priority in life. And using the spiritual priority and the practice, specifically potent is the practice of chanting the names of God. And once we start chanting the names of God, whilst being in pain, the pain would allow us to reject material existence because we find no pleasure in this body, and thereby we would also be able to understand the pleasure of spiritual focus and spiritual life. Pain is also used to break out of the norm. The norm is established by us, but one who is in pain will have the ability to reprioritize and will allow us to break out of the norm. We will also use pain to build strength. Now, this is again a great example which can be given is the gestation period of a caterpillar before it turns into a butterfly, for instance. A beautiful butterfly, for instance, is completely enclosed within the cocoon, and the cocoon very tightly binds the butterfly. And that period, it could be great suffering. It could be a period of great suffering, because one cannot imagine, being tightly bound. You cannot move a limb. You cannot do anything, and you're tightly bound for several days. In the lifetime of the caterpillar, that's probably a very long period of time where the caterpillar is encased in a cocoon. And while it's encased in a cocoon, it is suffering greatly. But that suffering is also a source of great strength, because the greater the period of suffering, the stronger the butterfly is in terms of its ability to fly. So for instance, if you have a scientific method which reduces the time which a certain caterpillar is supposed to spend in a cocoon, it could actually be very harmful, because the caterpillar would not have grown to full size. It would not have developed the strength in its wings, because the struggle against pain and struggle against being encased in the cocoon is actually extraordinarily beneficial for it to be able to break free. Similarly, the struggle and the pain and the impositions of this world should be used by us, and we should be able to push ourselves out of being cocooned in a material existence. So we start pushing ourselves based on this particular situation and the pressure that we are in. And finally, we're also saying that this is the way for us to be able to transcend matter. It is actually said that it is actually easier for one to pursue spiritual life under duress. And duress, for instance, could be a situation where you are extraordinarily busy. If you are extraordinarily busy and have little time for spiritual activity, then you are actually better situated than those who have a lot of time. And the reason for telling that is because if you have a situation where you're very busy and you can only take out half hour, you will ensure that that half hour is well used. So you will be able to do better than someone who has hours together in a day and everything gets frittered away, right? So let's have a little bit of a summary of what we spoke of until now. We said that pain and suffering are distinct. Pain and suffering, in other words, are not the same. Pain is physical, suffering is mental. Intensity of pain and suffering depends on three factors. We said the intensity depends on not knowing why one is suffering. We spoke of the second factor, which is not knowing when the pain is going to end, not knowing and not having anyone for us to be able to seek comfort in. In other words, being alone whilst being in pain and suffering. The intensity is very high. So it's also a lesson for us to be able to reach out to those who suffer, because we do understand that their suffering is going to be far more difficult for them to cross if they're going to be alone. Everybody who is suffering is going to need some help. They need succor, they need help, they need to be able to lean on someone's shoulder. So offering a shoulder is also an extraordinary way for us to be able to reduce the suffering. Now we also looked at 6 different categories or reasons for pain, right? And we said we exist, therefore we suffer. We exist in this human body, and this human body is destined to go through changes, and the consequence is that we suffer. We also suffer because we are a sum total of our past actions. In other words, we acted in the past, and as a consequence, we are suffering today. We also suffer because it's a reflection of our lifestyle, of how we lead our life on a day-to-day basis in the present. So we suffer due to the past, we suffer also due to the present. All of this is very encouraging because it allows us to make changes. If the past is making us suffer in the present, the actions in the present would eliminate the need of suffering and pain in the future. So we also talked about the fact that some of us are caregivers. We could be spiritual caregivers, we could be physical caregivers, we could also be caregivers like the psychiatrists and the psychologists who deal with the psychological aspect of life, which is the mental side. And the more exposed we are to the inabilities and the debilitating diseases of different kinds that other people come through, our susceptibility or vulnerability to these diseases greatly increases. When we are spiritual caregivers, we are very vulnerable to taking on negativity and energies of others. In other words, we say that we have to watch out for our weakness, we also have to watch out for the weakness of others that can affect us. And the other category of why do we suffer, we simply don't understand the big picture. We don't understand the big picture because we have very limited understanding of why we are going through a certain situation. And in most cases, we look at life and we reflect on what has happened in the past, and we will find that we ought to have good reasons to be very grateful. Many a circumstance allowed us to be very grateful. Right? So we are limited in our ability to understand the big picture. Therefore, we suffer. And the other category we spoke of why do we suffer, is that if you are a spiritual aspirant who are on a definitive spiritual path, there's a need for intensity. And without intensity, it's very difficult to break free. And as a consequence, to reach full potential, we need the intensity. Intensity can be provided by circumstances which could be very painful. So we also looked at how we could leverage pain. We could leverage pain to focus and to prioritize. We could leverage pain to break out of the norm, because certain painful situations in life could completely change our perspective, and we could break down the normative patterns. because we spoke of the fact that our past influences our present influences our future. Break out of the norm so that you don't suffer. We also use pain to build strength. We gave the example of the butterfly, the silkworm, which is cocooned, which stays in great suffering as it is bound very tightly by its own secretions. But that secretion, that being bound and that suffering is actually a source of great strength. So sometimes we go through adversity, but then as we go through adversity, it builds great strength because we are resourceful and we have the right help and we have the right healthy perspective towards life and we have proper expectations and we are grateful. We have the ability to use pain to build strength. We do not have to come forth wounded. We can come forth out of certain situations with greater strength, with greater perspective. And using pain to transcend matter, it's extraordinarily important for an aspiring spiritualist for them to be able to be more focused while they are in pain than being less focused. If you are in a situation of pain and you are a spiritualist, it doesn't matter what kind of pain it is. It's physical and you are in some kind of pain. You should learn to use those circumstances to be able to understand that you are not this body, you're able to focus higher. You're also able to understand that you can go deeper. So this is very important for us to be able to combine the combined spiritual practices such as chanting of the Lord's names, along with our circumstances, which could be debilitating in this world. When we combine the two and we depend and dive deeper and deeper into the chanting of the holy names, whilst we undergo challenges, it would allow us to penetrate certain areas of our consciousness which otherwise would be very difficult to access. We are covered by different layers of consciousness over several lifetimes, and pain and intensity which is produced by pain would allow us to have a laser-like focus which will allow us to penetrate and go above. So there is a use for pain, and we just wanted to give a little summary or sharing on the distinctions of pain and suffering. We want to share that because this is the predominant path or the predominant platform or the theme that is a part of the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. We see Arjuna, the general, in great suffering. He is suffering and he is bringing forth the suffering. The verses are very clear in enunciating his nature of the suffering. And it is very remarkable that someone who is so disciplined and who is known for his valor, is known for his ability to focus, has been reduced to such a situation. And this is the first theme. So we want to see if his suffering is going to transform him. In other words, in the future sessions, we will be looking to see how the Lord uses the great mental suffering of his dear friend, devotee Arjuna, and he uses that for him to be able to deliver a very profound message. Because when one is in such deep suffering, there's no clutter. He's looking for real answers. He is a sincere aspirant. He is not looking for, he's not complacent. He's not in a situation of complacence where it doesn't really matter as to whether one has a solution or doesn't have a solution. He is in a situation of intense suffering. He's looking for answers and he's being given answers. So this is being used, this whole circumstance and this mental inebriety and Arjuna's mental state is being used to deliver an extraordinary message because he is looking for answers. So somewhat qualifying the nature of someone who wants to hear something profound, someone who wants to hear and go deeper into spirituality. It requires focus. It requires a laser-like focus on the objective. It also requires for one to be able to accept the circumstances of life and be able to use the circumstances of life to be able to go towards that objective. Thank you very much.